I'd like to thank the organizers for this opportunity to address the Trade Wars and Supply Trade Forum today in Shanghai. My name is James Lockett, and I have a lot of experience, I would say, on both sides of this conflict that we're going to talk about today, the U.S. China Trade War. And I'm going to give you a case study on the use and abuse of tariffs in retaliation for alleged WTO rules violations. Now, as I said, I feel like I've been on both sides, and I actually have been. I spent a number of years in the General Counsel Office of the U.S. Department of Commerce as a trade remedies expert, representing the United States in the WTO on disputes, in NAFTA on disputes, and in national courts. I've also been a lecturer of WTO trade remedy system with the World Trade Institute. And then on the other side, of course, I have a long experience with China. I actually began studying Chinese law long ago, actually in 1981 at the School of Oriental and African Studies, together with international trade law. So it's interesting how the two of those have come together. But most recently, of course, after being part of many trade disputes involving China over the years, whether in private practice or in government practice, I joined Huawei Technologies. I was their vice president for trade facilitation and market access issues for 5+ years from 2013 to 2018. So I've seen both sides, and I've seen the Chinese side from the inside, and very much have been their advocate and their spokesperson. So I really, from the Department of Commerce, which is on one side now, obviously, and Huawei, which is on the other side of this, I've seen this from both sides. I've also counseled governments and so forth, as well as trained people on WTO issues throughout my career. So I'd like to convey some observations, again, with my experience studying China now since the early 1980s as well. So without further ado, let's take a look very quickly. And I'm going to give us an overview, and I don't want people to be bored by this, but I don't want people to miss it either, because I found a lot of people don't understand what's happening in this trade war, this conflict, this even geopolitical conflict, because they don't have the proper mindset and thinking about it. The obvious optics are that we have deficits, and China does represent a massive proportion of the U.S. trade deficit. And when President Trump came on board, obviously, this was a big issue to him, but it had become a big issue in Washington and in other capitals around the world long before that. China has been rising, obviously, and we know that. Let's just think how rapidly, though, China has risen. And again, in 1987, China actually passed the UK for the first time since the Qing dynasty. You can see, and they were just past the UK in 1987. A mere 15 years later, and right at the time of the WTO accession, China had already risen to be number 2 and would soon be number 1. And you'll notice that a difference in that shift also was that Asia suddenly had become the number 1 continent in the world by GDP, and Europe had slipped and North America had slipped. And this is part of an ongoing continuum. China obviously is already number 1 in a number of categories, whether it was global economic growth as an engine, as a manufacturer, as a trading nation, because of its economy. That was a pivotal moment in 2014 when it became the largest economy in the world, the largest middle class, the largest number of billionaires, and really importantly, AI research, solar power capacity, and a number of other areas. And we could add a number of others since this list was compiled by Ted. But you can really see that the balance really has already shifted. And this is causing a reaction in the United States and in other places, because they perceive themselves, particularly the United States, still perceives itself as number 1, and let's make America great again, right? And this has become almost a battle cry, and it's perceived as threatening in many quarters of the United States, and we downplay the importance of that key point and that key understanding in much of the rhetoric and thinking that goes behind a trade war. On the other side, we have China has always been a major power. There's only been a couple of centuries in the past 20 centuries or more where China has not been number one or number two in the world. And with Xi Jinping and his other leadership crew throughout the top of the Chinese government, there is a renewed emergence of authority and a sense that it is China's time once again to establish itself as a major nation. And this is seen as a threat in other nations. It's perceived as aggression against those nations rather than, from the Chinese standpoint, a very natural re-emergence as what they have always been. And this is, as many of you know, there are many China experts, I'm sure, in the room who will know that that is in fact the case. But the breaking point in this, make America great versus make China great, the breaking point in this from a WTO standpoint, and I think in the minds of many people, has come with the Made in China 2025 initiative that China obviously unleashed in recent years. And the reason this was problematic is that this was an industrial plan that people objected to, and the WTO rules didn't really fully fit it. There was so much of state capitalism, state organization, state-controlled and directed initiatives thought to be behind it and actually behind it. And it didn't fit into the WTO rule box, which of course was designed in the early 1990s and doesn't really fit the modern digital era in so many ways anymore. But this is where in Washington, D.C. and in other capitals, a lot of people began to shift. And I observed it very tangibly, not just in Washington, D.C., but when I was in China, I could see even amongst, for example, the American Chamber of Commerce in China or the European Chamber of Commerce in China, there was a definite shift in their emphasis. They had been far more supportive of remaining relaxed vis-a-vis China. And beginning in about 2016, 2017, that tide turned very decidedly. The climate in Washington had already shifted. And so what's important also to understand is this is not just a Trump administration issue. This is a decided a feeling across the board, across politics, that there's a problem, there is a China problem, and this is one that the WTO cannot fix. Now, let's throw in Mr. Trump. And whatever you may think of Donald Trump as a president or as a leader, and everybody has very diverse views on that subject. But if you read any of his books and if you actually understand his patterns, whatever you may think of his views, he does have one very clear barometer, and that is if he thinks something is unfair, he will address it. Now, we may not agree with his thinking as to what is unfair and what is not. That's a separate subject. But you can very clearly follow him when he perceives something as unfair, and that could be military expenditure, it could be trade deals, it could be how the WTO has been treated, trade balances, you name it. There's a wide range of issues, and when he finds something is unfair, the art of the deal, he comes in, he hits it hard, and then he starts to negotiate, and that's a very clear pattern with him. He believes that China has been unfair, and this is a fixation with him. It's also a fixation not just of Mr. Trump, but of a vast number of people. So whether you talk about Bob Lighthizer or Wilbur Ross, the USTR and Commerce leaders, or other major leaders, Peter Navarro and so forth in the US administration, but it trickles down into the think tanks, into all levels of government. My former colleagues in the Commerce Department and the Legal Department are really very strong feeling that China is being unfair and has to be addressed. So how did we get here? Well, there was a rapid expansion of exports from China in the post-2001 WTO accession period. There was a real lack of progress in the promised liberalization of the Chinese economy. There was also, even worse, a perceived lack of progress. And there was also, at the same time, an inability of the WTO to keep up with all these things. There was no update of the rules in the WTO. There was a gridlock, obviously, and remains a gridlock in WTO dispute settlement. And then we had this whole fight, and I remember very well During my time at Huawei, I represented Huawei in the World Economic Forum Trade and Investment Global Council, so the Global Council on Trade and Investment. And as the Trump administration was coming in, my perception was that we were headed into a major trade conflict over market economy status and these other issues. And I was told by, I won't name names, but very renowned thinkers. Obviously, at the World Economic Forum, you get some of the best of the best. And I was told, no. Once Mr. Trump comes in, the mainstream Republican thinkers will calm him down, and we will not have this protracted fight. And guess what? We've had a protracted fight. So this has had very serious consequences going forward. This led the United States to have recourse to a number of trade measures, and this is the key thing I want to get across to you. These are based on alleged WTO violations, but the U.S. took retaliatory measures or took action without going through the correct and proper WTO process of WTO's dispute settlement. So they also began fresh recourse to what are called safeguard measures. And safeguard measures had been kind of thrown out of the rule book by the WTO appellate body in the early 2000s when I was at the Commerce Department and I was part of that litigation. They've also had recourse to broad use of national security exceptions, and national security is now being interpreted to mean almost anything that is important to the country rather than what it was intended to mean. And there's a determination to take unilateral measures by the United States because multilateral responses have simply not worked and are perceived not to work. So there has also been retaliation by the EU, by multiple countries, of course, without going through WTO dispute settlement and WTO authorization of countermeasures. Now, that's not the way things are supposed to be done. There are basic rules in the WTO. We have the most favored nation rule. All countries are supposed to be treated on a non-discriminatory basis and treated in proper procedures. Any discriminatory actions have to be based on prescribed exceptions and by the WTO rules. Something like unfair trade should be addressed by the specific rules in there, namely anti-dumping, also subsidies for the most part. And if you have a disagreement, you should go to the WTO before you take action. That's how it's supposed to be done. There's also a broad geopolitical understanding in the world that we must balance our sovereign economic and security needs with a good faith commitment to abide by agreed rules. It is perceived in the United States that that geopolitical responsibility has not been kept up by China, and equally on the Chinese side, it's perceived that the US has resorted to unilateral kind of cowboy type systems. So there's a breakdown of this understanding of geopolitical understanding and good faith. And neither side perceives that it is operating in good faith. That's a serious problem. Now, we had a lot of traditional remedies, and I've alluded to a few of them. Of course, we had tariffs, and many other speakers here today will be talking about the tariff details. I'm going to leave that to them. But that was not considered as enough protection from China. So there has been a massive number of anti-dumping cases. When I was at the Commerce Department, I personally handled a number of them. So I fought against China. I handled anti-dumping cases. I worked for many years as a private lawyer in Brussels under the EU rules with this non-market economy methodology. I'm extremely familiar with it. I worked for 3 years in Vietnam, which has the same methodology as China. But when you have these non-market economy methods being used, the average anti-dumping duties are well documented. They're much, much higher than if you use market economy calculations. And this was felt by the Chinese to be quite wrong. But even anti-dumping was perceived in the United States and Europe as not enough. So trade remedy cases were expanded to subsidy cases, but it was still said that the subsidy rules couldn't capture all the full effects of Chinese state subsidies. And this was the ruin cry of the US domestic industry and the European domestic industry. They wanted more protection. And so now there's a resurrection of a third prong, safeguard measures. Now, in China's accession to the WTO, there had been some transitional safeguards. When those expired, the regular safeguards didn't work because there was WTO appellate body jurisprudence that, without going into the details, had made safeguards literally impossible for any government to impose in a WTO consistent manner. So safeguards were thrown out of the book, and that was a serious problem. Now, what's the response? And we now come to new measures being adopted, and most notably safeguard measures. So these can restrict a product temporarily if there's a domestic industry that is seriously injured or threatened by serious injury caused by an imports. The U.S. also resurrected, so that was one measure that was out of the arsenal. The U.S. resurrected that to everyone's astonishment because it's been dead. The second one, very unwelcome, was renewed use of Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which can investigate the effects of imports on quote unquote national security, whatever that means. And the U.S. has decided that it should interpret that according to its own understanding, which is extremely liberal. And lastly, the infamous Section 301, which authorizes the president to take all appropriate action, including retaliation, to remove any practice that violates a trade agreement or is unjustified, unreasonable, or discriminatory, or burdens or restricts U.S. commerce. Of course, an extremely broad definition. Now, here's the most important part of my presentation right here, because what I want you to understand is that the U.S. administration, and this bridged the Obama administration, but it was exacerbated considerably in the Trump administration, because they took a concerted view that the WTO could not protect U.S. national interests sufficiently, and it was more important for the U.S. to defend its interests against China than to protect and defend the current WTO system. Think about that again. But again, the U.S. then took those three types of actions that are not consistent with WTO law and jurisprudence. It launched a number of safeguard measures. It launched a number of national security measures. I'll talk about those in a second. And it launched a Section 301 measure, arguing that what it was finding in the Made in China 2025 and a few other areas was outside the scope of current WTO rules, and therefore it could act under Section 301. That's an assertion that the U.S. made so that it could take action without first going to the WTO, and that was a very convenient conclusion. We have a number of battlefields here: solar panels, washing machines, steel and aluminum as national security threats, unfair trade practices. Again, other people will address these in more detail. Autos, and now obviously the Huawei issues, but related more broadly to the internet and 5G. Serious, serious battlefields. And so we have ongoing, obviously, anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases, just dozens and dozens and dozens of them. We have global solar panel and washing machine measures imposed as a safeguard measure. We have Section 301, where China has been targeted. We have these intriguing national security findings, and again, these don't just necessarily target China, but they cover China as well as other countries. Autos obviously now in the mix, and the whole 5G and Huawei issue with the national security, full U.S. blockage of Huawei's supply chain and its U.S. partnerships. Now, again, the status of that is ongoing. Again, other speakers can talk into the details of that. But I think what we should realize is that the U.S. actions have resulted in China actually also raising tariffs on the United States and lowering tariffs on everybody else. So the Chinese response has been very interesting. Lower Chinese tariff for non-U.S. exporters. But China's tariffs have increased tariffs for U.S. exports in China. The rest of the world has got lower tariffs, putting U.S. exporters at a great competitive disadvantage, and also, interestingly, diversifying China's supply chain. As the Peterson Institute notes, the result is an eerie parallel to conditions U.S. exporters faced in the 1930s, the last great trade war that we had. This is just a quick graphic from the Peterson Institute, and you can see the red tariffs going up and the rest of the world marginally going down, falling for the rest of the world. I think that's really interesting. But to sum up, and my time is finished, I think we'll see whether the current WTO deadlock is a result of the U.S. China trade war, or whether the U.S. China trade war is a result of WTO failure. That's something that trade historians will debate. I think it's probably both in some ways. and a lot of xenophobia mixed in from the United States standpoint, a refusal to recognize the traditional status of China and regarding that as confrontational, mixed with China's unwillingness to actually do what it has promised to do, and that is a serious problem as well. Right now, the WTO is of almost no value to address the issues given its serious inability to address the disputes. And we have retaliation by numbers of countries. The respect for the WTO rules is at its lowest ebb that I can recall in my career, going now back almost 40 years studying WTO law and policy. And so it's predictable that we will see protracted tariff increases and a number of uncertainties in the relationship. But I do want people to understand that there is a very difficult problem with the relationship at present, and there's more to it than many people are willing to ascribe. But I trust that this presentation, in terms of trying to understand the dynamics of the Chinese side as well as the U.S. side, and understand that these perceptions are not going to go away. There might be short-term deals, but I don't expect that them to be anything more than temporary resolutions. We have a serious long-term difficulty, and neither side is ready to budge. So with that being said, I want to thank all of you for watching today. I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have. These are my contact details if you'd like to get in touch further. There's numerous ways to do so, and I'd be happy to discuss any of these issues further. And I'll turn it back over to the organizers. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.